thank you very much for coming to this morning's panel on good food. Thank you very much for coming, and we're going to have a really, really interesting morning with some snacks even in the back there. Anyway, my name is Charlotte Kim. I'm a partner at the law firm Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati. We work with a lot of technology-related companies, and I work with a lot of technology-related companies in the agriculture and food sector. So a lot of food tech and ag tech, both companies and investors. We have a really fantastic panel this morning. And before we jump in, I'd like to just ask each panelist to take a few minutes and just introduce themselves and give a little bit about, talk a little bit about their background. So if we could maybe start with Lisa at the end.
Sure. Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lisa Sebesta. I have just started a new company called Satari Capital, and I'm going to be working with investors, high net worth, and family offices on their investments, on their impact investments with a focus on sustainable food and agriculture. I'm also a managing partner of Fresh Source Capital. We raised a fund about 3 years ago to invest in sustainable food and agriculture businesses, primarily in the Northeast, and we have made about 12 portfolio investments in that space, so I've been involved in food for a few years now.
Hi, my name is Louisa Boa-Taylor. I'm head of media and research at AgFunder. AgFunder is an online venture capital platform investing in food and agriculture technology startups, which we launched in about 2013 when ag tech and food tech weren't really an industry at all. And we sort of saw there's this big funding deficit in the space, and there wasn't enough money going into food and agriculture compared to other sectors. So part of the way that we wanted to bring in more capital to this space was to build an ecosystem, and we did that through media and research, which is where I come in. We have a news site called AgFunder News, which has daily news on the fundings and trends that are in food and agriculture technology. And we also have research reports where we look at all the investment that goes into the space biannually across the globe.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Nadia Pinavaya, and I'm the founder and CEO of Euphoebe Healthcare, which is a company that I founded about 3 years ago to help transition people into a whole food, health-supportive, plant-based way of eating. Prior to that, I actually worked in finance. I was a managing director at Goldman Sachs and responsible for their hedge fund portfolio. And it was really 4 years ago that when I came to this country and faced with health crises and my children screaming, I want chicken nuggets and hot dogs and a probiotic sugary smoothie, that I thought, oh my God, we're addicted to crap and it's making us sick. And the solution isn't to eat less, move more, but it's to switch into a whole food, plant-based way of eating. And that's why I abandoned my wonderful career in finance to a life of poverty and building a program to help make it easy to transition into this healthy way of eating.
I'm Shen. Good morning, everyone. And I see experts in the audience, so this should really be a conversation, not a speaker panel. So I founded, currently I'm running a group I founded called Full Future Co. It's an accelerator that focuses on scale-up stage companies that's still very small, doing $1 million, but definitely in the regenerative agriculture and healthy food space with a multi-stage follow-on fund, Full Future Fund. And before that, I founded one of the first food accelerator, FoodX, both Full Future Co. and the early stage accelerators are based in Manhattan, and so we basically our thesis is kind of shared by the rest of the panel is that we believe food incredibly important impact and opportunity in terms of value creation, and if we change food, we change everything, and food happen to be the new black, so it's driven by millennials, and it's also it's a behavior shift happen first. It's consumer driven, supply chain constrained situation. So we focus on that responsible, environmentally conscientious sourcing and supply and healthier brands. Like if you look at through the UN SDG lens, like the 17 goals were more responsible consumption and life on land and life underwater. Thank you.
Thanks very much. If I could just ask also to get a sense in the audience, how many folks in the audience have actually made an investment in the food or agricultural space? Okay. How many are thinking of doing that? Okay, great, thank you. No, it's just helpful to get a sense. So one of the things that we'd like to talk about today is the differences between a conventional food supply chain and a more sort of food value-based system, and some of the changes that we're seeing in this space and why we're seeing them, and what makes that interesting for investment or not. And so just to cover some basics, and perhaps this is too basic for folks in the audience, but to want to just sort of start with a basic definition. When we talk about a conventional food supply chain, that we are really talking about how food moves from the producer to the consumer via production, processing, distribution, retailing, and then consumption. And one of the themes that I think we're talking about is how the changing consumer preferences and tastes are pulling changes in that traditional system towards something that is more of how the USDA, for example, would define a food value chain or system that's more of an alliance between farmers or the producers and other supply chain partners, and that produces high quality, differentiated food products, but it's more of a community and more of a shared system. And so one of the questions that we'd like to explore with this panel is, what do you think are some of the, how are you thinking about this space as an investor? Both from an investor and an impact perspective, but given the trends that you're seeing and the changes, et cetera, I mean, how are you, it's such a wide range of different changes, whether it's the millennials, whether it's just more education about this. How are you thinking about it as an investor and also from an impact perspective?
I guess I'll jump in. We launched, our Fresh Choice Capital launched this fund, like I said, in 2015, very much with the thesis that it's consumer demand driven. So that was really the investment thesis, and we marketed our fund as, a market return oriented fund, recognizing that sort of the overall trends that were happening in the food sector. So essentially, if you look at it from a macro level, big food is losing market share to all kinds of, I think one of the quotes I saw was big food is losing market share to startup granola. If you go into any Whole Foods, or now it's kind of in any other retail chain, you see all kinds of, really hip, young companies that have come along with some really innovative products. Many of them are touting healthier ingredients, clean labels, local sourcing, organic, all these transparency in the food supply chain, all these different values that speak to what that consumer wants. And that was the trend that we saw. Part of that, going along with that, is decentralizing the conventional food system. So we went through this massive effort, really led by policy after World War II, to centralize production and really focus on yield. And you know what? Congratulations, we did a great job, but we had all kinds of other externalities that we didn't know were going to happen. And now we're realizing the effects on health, the effects on climate, on environment, on animal welfare, all these things that really speak to a consumer's values. So while we came at it from this perspective of consumer demand is driving consumption behavior towards this, we also noticed that part of that, very much intertwined with that, is this value system that comes along with that. It's not just my personal health, but I also want to know, hey, is that farmer being treated fairly? How were those animals being treated when they were being raised, for this product? And so it kind of comes along, once you start sort of digging under the surface, which is what consumers were doing, you start kind of having to recognize and realize all the pieces that go into building this food value system. So I think while we started again with kind of the very financial aspect, and in the end we come away with this very impact report card basically that shows how moving away from the big system to a more decentralized, more value-based system is having an effect on all kinds of stakeholders in the system.
And I would just add sort of our journey at AgFunder as an investor and sort of communicator on the industry. We started out very much focused on agriculture technology. And one of the first big deals was Climate Corp being acquired by Monsanto, their first digital platform. And our big thesis was around agriculture was the least digitized industry in the world. So we were very focused on agriculture. And I think, though, since then, us and other investors in the space are really looking now across the whole value chain. So we sort of changed our definition to agri-food technology, so farm to fork. We're looking across the whole continuum. Not only are investors doing that, but entrepreneurs are as well. They're seeing the impact of their technologies across the supply chain, not just to farmers, and they're looking at it from the point of view of what do consumers want and how's that going to benefit farmers as well. And equally, not just focusing on the big corporates as being potential acquirers, thinking about building businesses from the ground up to be standalone businesses on their own, whether they IPO or go down another route is to be seen. But I think that's definitely something that's changed in just the sort of 5-6 years that we've been at this.
Yes, I will add from the consumer perspective. I think it's really interesting how the millennial and certainly Gen Z wants to eat in this way, wants to eat in a way that's more transparent and supportive, and actively is seeking that out. I think as you go up in kind of the older generation, there is big food got us into this mess, right? To your point of now, we're actually truly dependent. Big food created this ease and convenience which draws us back, which chemically changes what's happening in our body, that actually, ironically, the food that we are eating is making us hungrier. And so the brain is saying, eat more, and the CDC and the policy is eat less and get yourself to the gym. That's really hard when your brain is releasing ghrelin and is spiking itself all day long on insulin and saying, actually, eat more. And so as you look along the chain, I think the younger people get it and just want to eat then, so they want more choice. They want it at an affordable price. And I think there is a huge, a more challenging component to the older demographic that is now entering into, in the 40s and 50s, was saying, I still feel okay, but I'm a bit tired and sluggish and I want to feel better. However, I don't have a huge amount of time, so how do I make it, easy? To the older demographic who is actually now sick and contributing to the $1.8 trillion of annual healthcare dollars that we spend on managing, not treating chronic disease, who doesn't want to change, but should change and still has the ability to change. So it's definitely consumer-driven. Big food has too much vested interest. Big pharma has vested interest, big agro, to actually change it themselves. So we need to push in that consumer to carry on wanting to change, give them the choice, and also educate them and help them, because people love to hear good news about bad habits.
We started about 5 years ago, actually from impact into now impact investment opportunity. And at the time, a little bit my personal background, I had some severe wiring problem in my brain. I decided to do 2 doctorate after I left China. Well, some of you are a little over 30, so you may remember Tiananmen Square. So I was the first political exile among the student leadership to exile here. So I went into philosophy, went into a study of large social system and theory of change. And so I think about big useless questions. And it's not necessarily, CPG brands is going to make a lot of money and impact. So I was looking at it, for 10 years, everywhere I look, basically, it's almost all major challenges in the coming decades seem to come back to soil health, agriculture, and food. So at the time, my day job was I founded a few tech companies, and I ended up becoming an angel investor, learned the hard way, become fairly good at it, and then joined a global fund. And so eventually, these two things come together. Say, well, why don't we use take a page from Silicon Valley, use business accelerator, which is clearly a proven way of value creation, and almost basically now a rite of passage for founders, right? And with patient capital, multi-stage, early stage VC fund, so that was modeled without really expecting what the financial return looks. The reason we went into that is, and some of the advocacy people are in the room now, they've been doing the hats off to all of you, because you've been doing this for a couple of decades, when agriculture still didn't make such a big mess, right, for the whole world. So the reason we look at that is because purely from world-changing or tackling large systemic problems, as we all mentioned on this panel, that seems to be a consumer shift, because a cultural shift and behavior shift took place. People started to read labels, they don't really understand it, more than half of the labels anyway, but they still want to search for that. So, but very quickly, just give you some numbers that in my previous fund, who actually invested in one of the first two accelerators in food space. I mean, by now, there's well over 100 food accelerators. That's in 4 years. And some estimate nearly 200 food accelerators globally. So that's about 50 to 100 times growth in 4 years. So that's the ecosystem that's feeding into the opportunity, financial opportunity here. But in that accelerator, our fund invests in 8 accelerators, 1,200 active investment. My portfolio is now 40 companies, but my portfolio is 40% performing over the fund's average, over 1,200 investment. And that fund is a tier 1 fund. It has 33% year-over-year return in the last 23 years. I'm not that old, but I joined in the middle of the fund. But so that's kind of we kind of land to starting from the impact side to return. But one thing I do want to mention, without taking up all the time, is that there's a tendency, especially in the investment space, and with my brilliant colleagues and people I co-invest in Silicon Valley, there's a tendency to think about the world as software eating the world and tech-enabled. So I would want to make the differentiation here that food tech and food and agriculture as food and agriculture. And there's many facets to that, but for us, we're investing in food as food, agriculture as agriculture, so we look at major trends and disruption eating the world, very much like Elon Musk or Al Gore's blood fund in clean energy or in electric cars.
I'd like to dig into a little bit more that last point, Shen, that you just mentioned, because I think certainly there's just been an explosion in the last 3 years, say, of more money and investors in this space. As you say, just an explosion of accelerators. It's almost bewildering, the potential, just this whole space, the way it's grown. But there's also, as you say, a real big difference between sort of really software-enabled technologies and just the realities of producing food. And more sort of maybe precision agriculture, or just the realities of producing food in very large quantities, safely, and also at an affordable price. So I'm wondering if we could maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I think that might be helpful if you're an investor looking at this space and it's just growing, it's just becoming even more competent, more options. There's tons of ways to put money to work in this space, and if anything, your options are growing. And so if you're from that perspective, how are you? What are maybe some specific areas, if you had to pick 3 areas that you're really excited about now, and that you're really focused on now?
But that's like half dozen questions, all very deserving, really interesting discussion. But just to put some frame, I'll start off for the panel that we're talking about $9 trillion annual revenue space here globally. In the US alone, that's 1.5 to 1.8, depending on where you draw the line. Just food and beverages. So if you look at food and agriculture total, that's 9 trillion. How do we translate that? That's 23 times of today's global software market. And by any experts estimate, anywhere between that lowest, high 70% to 90 percentile that need to be and can be disrupted. So not only food is the new black, food is new internet to that extent. Yeah. So if you look at that, you look at just two leading markets like US and China. And the investment dollars now, I don't know you'll probably pull some numbers together, probably around 10, I think, 10 billion last year in that scale, right?
I think,
and
well, it
China,
depends how you define it, but yeah. It's
and in China, we finally got a kind of industry market-wide number for last year is 1.6 billion. So 10 to 2 billion in the two leading market, globally, that's $9 trillion market. So it's extremely underserved area of opportunity and impact. And you look at the particular one level down, just the people in our fund, the LPs, and it's their high net worth, ultra high net worth family offices and foundation endowment. So the institutions are completely missing. They're not at the table. They're at the forums, but not at the table. So that's just one frame. I'll talk about areas of interest later.
Louisa, I'm wondering if maybe from your perspective with Ag Funder in particular, if you might have some thoughts on this.
Yeah. So yeah, actually the funding numbers, yeah, it's globally agri-food tech was 10 billion of investment last year, and China was 1.6 or 1.8. And what was interesting in terms of China, and we're looking to sort of do more regional specific reports, is that we added an extra category, which to speak to your point about there being investing in food and ag, and then there's the tech portion, which was called premium branded foods and restaurants. That is, not a technology area, but it's a new area in China. Premiumization or looking for better quality food or brands is a big trend there. So it was interesting to see that in that specific market, that's an area that there's, quite a bit of investment going in there.
I want to add something for those of you who love chicken feet. The chicken feet company, yes. The leading chicken feet company in China just went public, $4 billion cap. And I would argue that's actually not an anomaly, because my favorite hot sauce company, Lao Gamma, is going public too in a matter of weeks.
Yeah, interesting. And another thing in China was unmanned stores, so kind of like robotic cafes type thing, or buying food without a person there. But yeah, so I mean, I think if you look at the different parts of the globe, there's lots of different trends in different countries, and the investor base has changed too. I think you're right. I think it has been mostly focused with smaller investors joining funds, and the funds, one of the biggest funds we have in the space, I think, is $250 million, which is S2G, who I think Sanjeev is meant to be here. So these aren't huge funds yet, and the investors are definitely quite sporadic and quite spread around. And actually, at Ag Funder, our funds are backed by a combination of some funds of funds. There are some individuals who are high net worth. So it is quite sparse, and the corporate venture capital side of things is starting to kind of get itself together and collect itself. But again, it's still quite piecemeal. Some corporates are choosing to invest in accelerators. Some are doing it in-house. Some are investing into other funds. So there's still definitely some organization to take place on the investor side.
Nadia?
Yeah, I'm going to answer your question, but from a different angle, from a bottom-up basis. So being in the food industry, where would I like to see capital put to work? So a good investment idea, if anyone's got the time, is production facilities. So as we're looking at making a healthy, whole, eating more plants easier, right? So big food got us into ease and convenience, and we all know what happened there. How do we make truly healthy eating easier? Right now in our kitchen, we're doing everything by hand, and as we're growing, we're looking for production facilities where we've got access to packaging equipment, to more scalable. It's a highly capital-intensive business, and all of the co-packing facilities that are out there we can only do one thing. The maximum we can do is we can make a tomato sauce. Like, where is the capital going towards helping businesses, bringing scale to businesses that can chop vegetables, cook vegetables, package it, different formats, and I think there is a huge amount of ancillary businesses that need to be built around the people that are doing the hard work of making healthy food, truly healthy food, easy and convenient to the consumer.
Lisa?
Yeah, I'd love to add to that point because I think it's absolutely right on that, you know, our agricultural system was built for massive scale, and when you start to decentralize, you by nature, you have this gap. I know in the afternoon panel, you know, Renee over here is going to talk a lot about what kind of equipment and other sort of obstacles to production exist to get to that right scale for a more decentralized system. And we know that not just is it unhealthy for us, but there's just a lot of risks involved with our massive centralized system now. I mean, we're very vulnerable to any kind of any sort of supply disruption. You know, the weather events are incredibly disruptive. So by doing, I kind of draw the parallel to decentralizing our electricity grid. We should absolutely be decentralizing our food supply. And so I think you're right, we need that sort of middle scale of not just of equipment, of farms, of processing facilities. I mean, I can't tell you how many companies I meet where they've either had to cobble together their own equipment because it existed at such a grand scale. They said, we won't even be there for 5 years at the rate we're growing, so we had to either buy it from Europe and have it shipped overseas, or basically build it by hand. So I think that's a big opportunity. And I completely agree, there's so much opportunity in technology to enable more efficiencies in the supply chain, and as well as transparency. I don't know we were going to talk about blockchain at all, but it's interesting to me that I think there's more and more attention being paid to that space in terms of how we can use that technology, not just to be more efficient and focus more on, we definitely need to focus on soil health, but ultimately to trace it through the supply chain and then be able to have a more robust supply chain.
Do you see corporates? What role do you see corporates playing with that? Because I was just wondering, it seems like part of. Do you think that the corporates are capable of helping with this, or are they just too constrained in terms of it? And I'm sorry, Louisa.
Yeah, that's right. I was just going to add about the decentralization comment you made, and about there are some online marketplaces. This is quite a big trend at the moment, is places where you can go and buy your input. Say if you're a farmer, you want to go and buy your seed, or you want to buy your fertilizer, you can do so online. That is literally cutting out the middleman, and in some cases cutting out the large agribusinesses. And the same on selling your grain and selling your produce. So this is the big trend at the moment. In terms of equipment and things like that, there are some leasing, sharing platforms that technology is hopefully going to help people who can't afford to purchase the equipment themselves. They can potentially share it. So there are some sort of sharing models that are coming through as well. But in terms of the corporate participation in things like blockchain, I mean, I'd love to hear what you all would think. I think for some supply chains, they're so dominant. So I was speaking to Olam the other day, who's a big, I'm sure probably everyone knows Olam, big commodities group in Asia, and they have been looking at things like blockchain. They've been looking at digitizing their communications with their farmers, and they've actually decided to build their own internal solutions to do this, as opposed to, investing in a startup or contracting with another technology provider. And I think for them at this point, they're in a bit of a wait and see kind of mode. They want to try and deploy some of these technologies to help communicate with their farmers, then track all their commodities through the supply chain, and then communicate better with their end customers. I think it's important that they are making moves in the space and validating the models for some of these startups that might bring through better technologies. Whether they're then going to be essential that they participate, if you do have some of this disintermediation or decentralization, I think remains to be seen.
To a question of corporate, no problem. I don't know. I mean, if history is any guide, that may not happen, but in the last couple of years, there's certainly a honeymoon period where the corporate are trying to do this. I mean, you think about big food, right? I mean, to participate or even to set up $100, $200 million fund, that doesn't warrant a line item for boardroom discussions, right? It's just, so they're really trying to basically outsource R&D, right? But meanwhile, the numbers are very telling. It's not just McDonald's it's that the revenue plateau or decrease over the last 4 years. It's where do I start? I mean, last 2 months, right? I mean, I think Pepsi and Campbell, you name it. I mean, they're all, in the last 10 years, their top line dropped a total valuation of one of them. their sales dropped somewhere around $20 billion. So, and this includes all the acquisitions. So the acquisitions happening earlier, which come to one of kind of central topics here, the opportunity is $9 trillion. I mean, majority of that, right? But all the interesting stuff is happening in early stage. So what do you do with it? I mean, my last fund, it's not just me, there's some other partner, we raised $330 million, right? And that's over 8 accelerators. But for Full Future Co., no matter how we slice and dice, if we want to have even twice as many as a small VC's portfolio, which is about 25 up to 30 companies, that is about a third of our total accelerator portfolio. The maximum we can invest in the next 4 or 5 years is $55 million. So we're targeting 30. There's a lot of interest out there, but that's all. So how does that translate? I don't know your experiences, but I mean, I think Fred Source, I mean, it's in that range, and it's so how do you translate that into kind of a major investment opportunity? Well, you have to, one, patient, and two, obviously, and two, maybe fund of funds is the way to go, and maybe alternative financing, and this is not just a information, but this is a big topic about the advantages and uniqueness about physical real assets and physical goods, manufacturing, co-packing, delivering, fleet of trucks, and all that. Right? So that and credit facility makes sense. So when you add all that up together, you start to look at a 9-figure or higher number. So that might be it's just again, all the opportunities are in early stage. Yeah. And you look at acquisition space. So this is where corporate take notice, right? Mm-hmm. So 4 years ago, one of our principals who founded the first healthy baby brand, and her company was at $89 million revenue, sold for $250 to Campbell Soup, right? That is 3x top line. Right? Fast forward last year, 6.5x. In 3.5 years, it more than double, right? And let's translate that number. This is only for CPG. So that is basically at par with the 7x tech exit, right? So when I say food is new internet, I literally mean, mathematically mean that. Right? So now, that's the brands, and maybe now starting in marketplaces, subscription, online sales, e-commerce, food e-commerce about 4%, and that alone is 7x lower than average of e-commerce, right? So right there is a major opportunity just to be at eye level, because millennials don't have any difficulty buying eggs and bananas online versus buying batteries and books, right? So, but anyway, yeah.
I'd like to switch focus a little bit, and maybe, Jose, if you might, we have a little handout which just has some basic statistics on mostly early stage investing in this field, but it basically just a little bit of background to compare to overall the tech market investing. And the top line, the high line is that there's been a huge amount of money invested in 2018, also in 2017, in tech generally. And in ag and food tech, that trend is also reflected. So there's just a lot of money. Still a relatively long period to exit. We're still looking at 5, 6, 7 years. But I'd like to, for the rest of the period, like to sort of switch focus a little bit and switch perspective and look at it from the perspective of an entrepreneur and a company like Nadia, looking to raise capital as the business grows, as the company grows. And Nadia, I wonder if you might just sort of talk a little bit about your experiences with sort of, how you thought about, which investors to approach, at what stage, et cetera, some of the questions and some of the factors that you considered, and also some of the reactions that you encountered.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I can summarize it. It's in one sentence. it's really difficult. It's really, really hard. And as a small, I mean, we'll go through kind of some of the challenges, but as a small company, when it's a real food, where you're actually making and you're doing the work and you're doing the distribution, it's hard to be the unicorn in the room. It's hard to say, I am the next Uber. And sometimes it's hard to get the attention of the investor who is conditioned to looking for the next Uber and looking for the next unicorn. So that's kind of, my top line. In terms of, my journey, as I indicated earlier, Euphoebe kind of found me, and it was driven out of a desire to change how we eat through health. That was the principal motivation. And I spent 6 months reading kind of academic papers and figuring out I wanted to create this program. And then I did a May pilot, and I tested the results, and the results were amazing, in line with academic literature. And I thought, okay, I have a business. I have a business idea here, driven by passion, truly, because if I could start again, I would be doing something different, but driven by passion. And then you think, well, how do I go about funding this? How do I start it? And I think as the entrepreneur, just at that outset, you have, the different choices. I was lucky enough that I had some savings to say, all right, I'm going to do this proof of concept myself, and put some money in and kind of bootstrap it, do it slowly. Or do you go sell the big idea? And so my evolution was to put my Goldman Sachs savings in it and put my money where my mouth was, and start to build that up. And that was a route that I chose to take. And over time, the business started growing, and we needed more capital. And that was my first experience of then looking to raise outside capital as an entrepreneur. In my old Goldman Sachs days, I was, raising capital for our fund of hedge fund business, and it's a lot easier when you've got the business card and they say, sure, I'll take your meeting. And it's a lot easier when you've got groups of salespeople setting up the meetings with the institutional investors and you get wheeled in. So doing it as an entrepreneur is really hard. I think doing it as a woman, I think, can make it harder too. That's a bigger conversation, but I will just put that out there. And it's hard to kind of, so you start, depending on the size of capital that you want, will direct where you go. And so I started off with, it wasn't family and friends, because I always felt uncomfortable putting kind of family and friends there. I had enough of my own family. But went with people that had a passion in what we're doing. But it's challenging to raise, so number one, it's really time consuming. It is hard and it's time consuming. Two, you have to figure out who is interested in what you're doing and speak to those people. And then three, there's a little bit of this sounds like a great idea, you're doing really well, there's a lot of great traction, but come back when you've grown a little bit more. I'm like, thanks, I'd love to keep in touch, but actually when I've gone to that next stage, I don't really need you. So there is that, on the other side, I'm sure, and I've sat on both sides, but there's that thing of like, size your investment. Like, if you believe in this space, and I think you were saying that, make a series of investments where if you think the risk is high, be diversified, right? Make small series of investments. But I think if everyone's waiting for what's the next big thing out there, we're not actually doing service to the people that are creative and on the ground and actually, building these new businesses. So I think, those were my experiences of getting that. And one final thing is, we did actually close our round of financing. But I walked into the office, back to the corporate, of a big food company, but I think one that I hold in high regard, where the CEO really is speaking about food for health. And I met with their venture capital arm. And I met with an amazing woman who truly wants to diversify their current portfolio into more food supportive businesses. They also have a healthcare angle. So it was just a hand in glove. And I was telling her about Euphoebe, and I was telling her, we're raising $1 million, and she, we're like hand in glove. And she said, if you were raising 5, then, I could help you out. But she said, when we're talking about the disruption in healthcare, she said, if you'd come to me with the idea that you're disrupting healthcare, there are people walking into this office on the idea and walking out with $5 million of financing. And so I kind of sat in this meeting and I said, should I be, rather than piecemeal-making it, do you want to be selling that bigger idea? And I think that is a very hard decision as an entrepreneur, and maybe it boils down to character, and maybe, again, there's more of that gender bias things, well, I want to prove I can do it, but it's really hard in today's age where we hear about all this money in the system ready to be available, but a lot of it is being directed to people that have, the big idea, and sometimes it's harder to get smaller amounts of capital with people that are actually doing the job.
Yeah.
Well, here you have it. Don't do a startup. Right?
And I've met you 4 years ago.
Exactly. Yeah. I have friends of friends that we have been doing this for a long time. They often come to me and say, "Oh, Shen, I have a question." I say, "Well, have your tea, order your lunch." The answer is no. So don't do it. It's just, I have 3 children and 40 companies. That's my life. And because I constantly raise money for them, we take significant minority in those companies. So, but being the trust advisor, mentor, and accelerator program, we raise money. It's incredibly hard. So there's a apparent paradox here, right? So I'm describing how big the opportunity is, and the exits more than doubles, and all of that. And at the same time, a big part of that is just incredibly hard. To start something really new from 0 to 1, but also I think depends on where, right? Because when you look at, so we start to kind of touch upon this, all of us, that the CPG space is proven. Everybody's going after CPG because you just do the math, right? There's the 10 big food are all in trouble, and in 20 years, and this may sound radical, it's just going to happen, and it's happening. That all those big brands are going to be either fundamentally transformed, and most of them are going to be gone. In their place, whether it's brands and restaurants and marketplaces, there will be a new group of leading companies, and they're not going to be smaller. They're going to be at the level of Facebook. I'll go through one short case study, if time allows, about Kind Bar versus Facebook. I use this in my business school lectures now, and I'm comparing defensive plays by big groups. And one just gives numbers, and even though they're not direct comparable, Mars value Kind Bar at $4 billion as in the defensive play, I believe, and where Microsoft did $250 million, which is astronomical number at the time for Facebook, so that other overlords of Silicon Valley don't buy it up, right? So there are all of that, but back to the early stage food stuff. CPG is on nightcloud, right? But if you look at really the bigger opportunities and also systemically critical pieces of the whole supply chain, just use China as a smaller example, right? Only a little over 100 million out of that 1.6 billion investments are in the supply chain, agriculture and facilities and so on, right? The overwhelming majority, and this is slightly better, but generally true in the U.S. and the rest of major markets, is in the brands and a little bit in the marketplace. So the flip side is that there's more opportunity actually in the supply chain, in the non-sexy part of the food hubs and the basically alternative grocery, whether it's direct to consumer or B2B, which is to restaurants and hotels. But I'll also address one thing that's actually advantageous for real food entrepreneurs. And I will start with the data for our companies. We started by looking at the financial thesis and capital thesis, right? So, well, if Pioneer Gap, or you're looking at the blue ocean idea that in 20 years things will happen this way, but you don't want to be the pioneer. We know what happened to pioneers, so you get an arrow in the back, right? So that's in a way known as a Pioneer Gap. So how do who are the first ones, first movers? They're usually end up dead, right? So if that risk is translated into 2x, even 3x, right? So how do we bridge that gap, right? So here comes a unique advantage that high-tech companies do not have, right? So we look at our companies, we say, well, if we could double the investment between VC equity investment versus non-equity, non-dilutional, or non-concentrated sources, right? I just give you the end number now. 4 years later, we have 3 to 2. So it's a 1 million investment by my fund and other VC investors. There are 1.5 million from USDA grants, philanthropic dollars, and this is not counting PRIs, which is a very important aspect. But this includes credit and debt facilities. If we include PRI, non-concentrated investment, that's 4 to 1. I'm not saying that's 4 to 1, right? So $5 million raise, 4 million are the kind of money that high-tech companies, the Facebooks and Ubers, cannot access, right? So that's quite significant, you know. So anyway.
I think we could do a whole separate session on non-dilutive capital.
That's the next room, right?
And then different sources of that. Lisa, I'm wondering if I could ask you to say a couple words on what we've been talking about.
In terms of, well, one point I wanted to just kind of, emphasize that Shen was talking about was the middle of the supply chain and investments needed there. The reason why, I think it's part of the reason why there hasn't been a lot of investments there is because there's the multiples haven't been there. You don't have, I completely agree. I call the CPG companies the well-worn pathway. And I can't tell you how many, I mean, all these small little companies that they're producing their whatever, their cracker or their drink themselves, and then they always say, I'm just going to outsource it. And I'm going to be a branding company because that's where the returns are and that's what my investors want me to do. So I think you're absolutely right. I'm not quite sure where those investment dollars are going to come from yet for the middle of the supply chain because I don't know where the return is going to come from. I think that to me isn't clear yet.
That's interesting. Any questions from the audience? I would like to please, encourage folks from the audience to have their questions. We have a microphone.
Thanks. So given the SDGs and your emphasis, Shen, on thinking about those in the context of your work, I haven't heard any of you really talk about the extent to which either investors or entrepreneurs are thinking about impact measurements around how do you get to the SDGs that relate to food and ag and health through the investments in the transformation of the food system throughout the supply chain.
Do you want to tell us who you are? Or?
Oh, sorry, I'm Carrie Norton. I'm an entrepreneur.
Anyone to start that?
Sure. Yep, I'll start that one too. I do see many more investors now kind of rallying around the SDGs, which is great. I think the initial sort of reporting mechanism is, I can point to even in Fresh Sources portfolio, I can say, I know that our investment in Ocean Approved, which is a seaweed company, improves life below water. It has an effect on climate. It's sustainably produced. So I can draw those parallels to, certain of the SDG goals. I think the measurement is where is challenging. That's really hard. In some of the SDGs, there are specific quantitative targets. I can't remember exactly which one it is. I think it's around sustainable production, or it might be cities where there's a target around food waste. You probably, I don't know if you, anyway. So where there is something that's very measurable, we can say within our companies, we know that these companies are helping reduce food waste by X number of tons through the work that they're doing. So we do try to measure that. I think measurement for us is an evolving process. It's something, we are not measuring carbon yet. That's probably a next step for us, is measuring, and I see Ridge is nodding because he's talking, we're thinking about things like carbon sequestration in the soil, which is what his company, Big Picture Beef, is doing. So I think we're getting there. I think it's just, we really need to come down to, we have this kind of higher level picture. Let's dig underneath and figure out what exactly are the measurement tools that we're going to need to develop in order to prove that we're actually working towards them.
Can I just add 2 things on the back of that? So if we, I think it's answering your question, if we all adopted a whole food plant-based diet, and this is very relevant after the UN climate conference that we had, so everyone went whole food, plant-based, vegan, 75% of all farmland could be reduced. We'd free up land the size of Africa. Think of that as a giant forest and the trees and the reduction in carbon that would take naturally place from that. And we'd reduce emissions by 25%. Changing how people eat is the biggest single factor that we can all do as individuals to improve our climate situation.
Well, the supply chain we're talking about is responsible production, right? And a lot of better for your brands are definitely responsible consumption. Life on land. So I mean, so for us, we do measure several of them, but it's not so much SDG. SDG is really great for us, at least, conversational frames. I mean, thinking through, right? But we, when it comes to the convergence of agri-food innovation and climate action, for example, carbon sink, right, carbon sequestration, we actually refer to more drawdown project, where interesting enough that during UNGA and the Governor Brown's Climate Action Summit in California, and then after that, last week in Paris, we've been talking about this for the last few weeks, 3 years into SDG, right? So the interesting enough, 2 topics here, highly relevant today. More than clean energy, food agriculture is the biggest category in terms of carbon sink. When we have, I think Drawdown did 19 areas. Plant-based is one of the top areas. This is not counting refrigeration, which is a lot of it for food. Not even counting that, just food, right? So by our calculation, based on Drawdown and other sources, 5 times as impactful, meaning that compared to clean energy, meaning that the cost you take and the value you'll create just in carbon sequestration in food agriculture is 5 times more than clean energy. The second category I'll just throw out there, after food, is women, due to mainly family planning and education for women and girls. So, so even if we're talking about just climate action, food agriculture and women are the most important areas.
Bingo.
So there's a real silver lining to what you're trying to do. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mark Diaz with the Aspen Institute. I'm interested in, we've talked a lot about the B2C side. I'm really interested in the B2B side and any insights you all have about ways to, effectively think about those, incremental improvements in the very large global supply chains. So ways you could improve sustainability among large food commodity buyers, working with existing at-scale players, whether they be retailers, whether they be food production companies, and if you have any insights as to, how can companies with either innovative practices or products work in the sort of, that middleware space that it sounds like is sort of lacking, and if there are any examples you might hold up for us about companies that are doing that well.
I think we could probably go back to food waste. There are a lot of entrepreneurs and innovators looking at that from various different angles. In the supply chain, there's quite a few that are looking at food freshness, maintaining food freshness, and also monitoring food throughout the supply chain. So there's a company called Appeal Sciences, which has a biofilm which can be sprayed onto produce and help to preserve it that way. It's a natural product. There's also tracking, so whether that's sensor technologies that could go into a pallet of berries and track, the journey of that through the supply chain and find out if there are any events where they were subjected to heat or moisture or anything like that. And that's really putting the responsibility of that journey on the key players at that specific point. And if then tools like blockchain are used to, transmit that data, essentially, then you've got quite a good bulletproof ledger. I think one of the concerns that I would have thinking about those technologies is ensuring adoption throughout the supply chain. People talk about blockchain being this amazing solution for everyone, but it's only going to be as good as the data that goes into it still, and so ways to make sure that everyone is fully incentivized to input the data in the right way, I think is really important. But that's just one example. Lisa?
Yeah, I think another example is in seafood. I think there's a couple of trends going on there. One is actually decommoditization, trying to differentiate sort of, I think what happens with a lot of food products is that sometimes they get dumped into a commodity market, whereas if I don't have a particularly discerning palate, but many people do. And so they might value an oyster from a certain part of Maine more than they would from Maryland, for example. So I do see technology being able to sort of help, again, differentiate and give transparency in the supply chain in order to decommoditize. So that's going to have a different value from this. And the other part within seafood is taking advantage of underutilized species. We know we are depleting the ocean in terms of sort of the major fish that most of us eat. And there are efforts to take advantage of fish that, for the moment, there are still plentiful supply of, and utilize those. And there's a group actually in Boston called Red's Best that's working with chefs to really kind of create a new market for some of these underutilized species that is often bycatch. And if there's no market for it, they get caught and then they get thrown overboard. But if there's a market for it, then they'll get brought to port and used.
Nadia?
Yes, may I just add something? So in that B2B to C space, I think there is a huge opportunity for the corporates, for the hospitals, for those entities, for the big CPGs to be encouraging, implementing the consumer to help them change. And to give you a specific example of that, referring back to that big CPG where they really sit at the nexus of food and health, they have hundreds of medical salespeople that are knocking on physicians' doors and nurse practitioners' doors selling baby milk or, medical products. They should be selling food, right? Proper food. And so I think there is a confluence of getting in front of the big CPG to be able to encourage people and impact their health through food. And that's a great way to kind of spread the word. And we see that also with the medical institutions, with the insurance companies. It's incredibly hard, but having the B2B to C approach, I think, will actually make it easier to implement the changes.
Yes, that's a good way to actually understand the space. I mean, if we back into using the large numbers and back into potential areas of innovations, that there's a half of the market restaurant, half are grocery, right? So you look at grocery, that's B2B to C, right? The restaurant is more typically B2B than restaurant to C, right? So I mean, there's mind-boggling areas of I mean, just one thing that I guess Lisa mentioned about not seeing multiples. That's a separate discussion, but just give you our journey of understanding that B2B space with one example is that four and a half years ago, my second investment, I now made 52 investment. Second investment is in a New York company called Next Organics. They're aggregator of local farms, usually within 80 miles is properly considered local, and they have over 1,000 families and they aggregate of a couple hundred farms, right? So that's known as, we call it super CSA, community supported agriculture, but it's really unsexy aspects of supply chain, which is food hubs, right? But food hubs as alternative to the current grocery shopping, and there's now a local food economy, which is very encouraging. But just here's the numbers, right? At that time, there's roughly about 70 food hubs across North America. Last year, 500, right? So that's 7 times growth in 4 years. And they're doing about 1 to 5 million, so they're tiny, right? But if you do the total math, the math of the whole market, that's $1 or $2 billion. I mean, what does that compare to? That compared to 700 billion grocery shopping market in North America, right? So again, it's hugely underserved. And where does the multiple come from? Well, the first gen have died. I mean, like door-to-door relay and all that. But I think this is one of those blue ocean ideas when you have high narrative thesis, non-correlated to market risk. And again, just look at Gore Block Fund, and with a longer view, there will be huge returns because futurists tend to be correct when it comes to this kind of trends. It's just not, we don't have immediate comparables to exits. Yeah.
We have another question in the audience.
Yes, so I think my question goes to partially that question around multiples in public policy, U.S. and other countries, and how it supports moving to a decentralized structure, moving to food hubs. USDA program around farmers markets was really successful, but is a very micro program in a larger, program that supports monoculture factory farming. So. Can you point to maybe positive policies that have been helping support this transition, and where the most fundamental shifts need to be to kind of get the wind at the backs?
I think the one example I can think of is the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. And I think that's also part of USDA, that it's funding that goes through other organizations. CDFIs can have access to that funding. That's so it's a source of government money where that they can use to support local initiatives. It's still, to your point, I love the fact that you talk about the scale, because it's such a drop in the bucket, and it makes us feel good about the work we're doing. But we realize that we're really up against a gorilla here, and that we're starting from a pretty low level, and we've got a ways to go, I think.
Well, the positive on the federal level is the Farm Bill, which may or may not continue, right? But in the Farm Bill, there's $100 million that matches basically real health system that is food, right? Food, medicinal, right? And food as medicine, and that's $100 million, right? And unfortunately, our policy environment is central to a systemic problem that lead us here. Right, and the USDA subsidies to the full crops alone on corn and wheat is a major hurdle. When our companies and food innovators get to that scale, we're going to be up against major subsidies. And so why 75% of all packaged product in the U.S. have corn in it, because it's subsidized, right? So at the state, local level, there are also positive things to point to, like soda tax, right? So there's no shortage of solution, especially in the design area such as policy. It's very clear, right? At the global level, at climate level, at the state, at the Paris Accord level, at state and city level, and local food supply chain. It's just it's not something we can count on, but fortunately, I think impact investing and all this innovative millennial entrepreneurship probably will be a better hope. Yeah.
I think we have another question in the audience.
Hi, it's Andrew Howell from Citi. Two questions from me. First, just curious about your thoughts on innovation in one area of food industry, which is plant-based meat alternatives, and particularly the plant-based burger, which in my impression is kind of reaching an inflection point, given innovation we're seeing, and particularly in my community. Impossible Foods is doing some very interesting things with the heme technology, and so just curious if you agree that that's kind of becoming big, and what the potential impact of that is. And second question is on packaging, and I'm kind of firstly curious, when you talk about food investment and sustainability, is the packaging an important part of it? For lots of foods, packaging is actually much of what you're buying. For example, bottled water is basically 80% you're buying packaging. So I'm curious how you think about that, and how you see innovation in packaging, and particularly with big food, where we're dealing with a real crisis now in the United States with recycling and waste management, and is packaging basically keeping up with the innovation that you're seeing in other parts of the chain with food?
No. So the plant-based, so a couple of weeks ago I was in San Francisco for the Good Food Institute conference, and it was the coming together of really the plant-based investing community. And it actually reminded me back of my hedge fund days back in 1999, where it still felt like this cottage industry. It was and it was actually hard to get in. It was massively oversold. With this, the purpose of bringing that up is I do believe that we are at the beginning stages of a plant-based investing trend. So that's kind of the premise. There was a huge amount of conversation about, Impossible Burger, Beyond Meat, and interestingly, big food was all at that conference, because we had Kellogg, we had Heinz, and had the food scientists saying, how can we replicate the taste of charred meat for the flexitarian consumer. And that's really the market they're going after. The current plant-based meat alternative market is still tiny. I mean, the number they were talking about was 1% to 2% of all meat sales. I think that, I mean, for me, that sounds high. We've got non-dairy milk alternatives that are around kind of 10%. So I do think the consumer demand for plant-based meat alternatives will continue. I reflect on the health aspects of some of those plant-based alternatives. And I encourage those that want to move into a plant-based way of eating to eat more vegetable, eat the real things rather than many of these things that are manufactured. However, there's clearly a sustainable angle to moving into this space. I do think that the technology, if that is the word that we should be using, and I think it is, will continue. There is a huge market as we're becoming more aware of the impact it has on our climate, that the flexitarian consumer will want to continue to eat more of these. So, and I'll leave the panel to add anything more to that. Very quickly, in answer to your packaging, it plagues me. It's something that we struggle with because we ship our food and we put it in a cornstarch insulation box that you can dissolve underwater. And that's cool and people like that and we try our best to do what we can, but it's not as effective as polystyrene. And clearly we're not going to go down that route. And it's really hard to find the alternatives. We are not big into plastic trays. We don't do any of that. Our food, as you can see on the snacks, are in these still plastic, but BPA-free bags. And we've been looking for a paper solution that can hold our food. Our food is freshly made and then frozen, that will contain that. And you can't find it. So the food, we want to do the right thing. We're trying all of our things, but the packaging industry has not kept up at all.
I think I've probably come across one startup that's innovating in plastic, has a compostable plastic container for food and for clothing as well. So yeah, that's definitely behind the times. And I'll just reiterate what you're saying about the plant-based space. Yes, lots of demand. We sort of sometimes worry if it's going to be margarine 2.0 and that a large amount of processing that's going into these alternatives is going to turn out to actually not be very good for you. But I think the general trend, hopefully those things like that will be discovered and figured out.
Yeah, well, meat, I was wondering when that question will come up, right? But meat alternative and plant-based are not just technically different, but it's an important one to actually feed into a broader discussion we started, which is TAC versus non-TAC. And I will define non-TAC. But before that, actually, I was thinking of bringing our mushroom jerky, and we have a vegan seafood company. So the non-TAC is not just some mythical area. We're talking about two resilient systems that's just fundamentally smarter than the ones and zeros and computing power. That's called biodiversity or nature or culinary traditions, which is culture. Right? So I mean, those, I think, in terms of our macro thesis, we're putting our money behind this, is that if you look at preparing and preserving food versus processing food, then we probably, with some long view and patient capital, will generate huge return and impact, right? So the example would be why I bring up mushroom jerky, one of our companies who we're really proud of. I mean, I literally dreamed that product 3 years ago. I said, well, seaweed is commonplace now, but it's not real American snack. It's not substantial enough. Wouldn't it be great to have a kelp and mushroom jerky, right? And sure enough, 2 years ago, there's 4 products came out. I mean, this is almost like anything you can dream about in space. They exist, right? And so we took the leading company in the mushroom jerky space based on shiitake mushroom. I just couldn't feed supposedly 50, 60 people in this room, so I decided not to bring. But you look at that versus cellular agriculture. That's the meat alternative that grown, So our hesitation. I mean, first of all, we're accelerator fund. We're not non-ideological except impact frame. So I guess we are a little bit ideological, but we believe in the real world there are going to be multi-part solutions. So we're not against certain, but we have a preference, not based on cultural preference and personal taste, but based on our mathematical thesis that if we tap into more wholesome food and preserve and prepare it instead of processing it, then we tap into the resilience of those two smarter systems where cellular agriculture, and I'll throw another big one in there, is soil-based agriculture and soil-less agriculture, often mostly, not all, mostly urban agriculture. We'll strongly lean toward soil-based or whole food preservation prepare approach, nature and culture, versus more science. I think, the fact that the oldest living Twinkie is 41 years old and the oldest living McDonald's burger is 19-year-old tell us something. We don't need that kind of science. We need a different kind of science, which is tried and true. Like when we look at the plant-based solutions, right? We thought, well, the Buddhists have done this for a couple of thousand years. They may know one or two things about this, right? So that's where we look for solutions,
Lisa, I think you may have the last word, because I think we're running out of time.
Well, actually, in that case, I'll make a plug for the afternoon panel, because we're going to be continuing this discussion. I hope you all can make it. And we're also going to have two, it's kind of relevant to your last point, two businesses that will present sort of their case studies. One is sort of the alternative to plant-based meats, he's still there, Ridge Shin from Big Picture Beef. So interestingly, in Drawdown, it's definitely plant-based eating is one big way to reduce carbon emissions, but I don't think we don't want to neglect the fact that if we actually treat animals the way that nature intended, that we can do a lot of good for the land as well. And so Ridge is going to be speaking about Big Picture Beef. And then to the packaging, a woman named Brianna Warner from Ocean Approved, which makes edible seaweed, is going to be talking about her products. They're launching a retail brand. They're right now in food service, but a big component of what they're thinking about is packaging and making sure that, particularly for a brand called Ocean Approved, that it's not unrecyclable plastic. So I hope you all can make it.